You won't be traveling past stars tonight, but into a long house wrapped in cedar breath and the hush of ancient promises. Somewhere in the glow between firelight and memory, a belt of small shell beads begins to shimmer, not for beauty, but for remembrance. No fanfare, no alarm, just quiet order carved into patterns, each one a whispering thread and a woven treaty older than maps dot. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Dim the lights. Let the hush settle over you like soft moss. What you'll hear tonight won't. Ask for attention, it will simply be there, like the rhythm of someone else's breath beside you, slow and sure. This isn't history as thunder, it's memory as a quiet drumbeat. Gentle, low, insistent. The fire doesn't crackle to impress. It exhales. The owl outside isn't mysterious, it's just counting, and the beads. They glint like constellations translated into law. You don't need to memorize anything, just listen. And let your thoughts drift, like smoke between rafters. If these myth-shaped stories help you rest, feel free to subscribe, or write your time and place in the comments. Sometimes the next story begins exactly where yours fades into sleep.now. A hand lifts the wampum, and we begin. A soft hand lifts a strand, and the purplish quahug shells catch the firelight and slow pulses little heartbeats of history. Every pattern means a clause, every clause a memory, like a bedtime checklist scribbled by an especially meticulous diplomat. One belt records a condolence ceremony so detailed that even the number of tears is counted. Another politely reminds visiting messengers not to gossip. Modern lawyers might envy such efficient jewelry, though their briefcases would jingle awkwardly if they tried the same trick. The apprentice bead reader mouths the glyphs under her breath, almost singing them, and the timbre is low enough to be mistaken for the hush of distant rain. Somewhere deeper in the hall, an elder clears his throat the way a turtle might clear a pond, unhurried, unavoidable, faintly amused. He notes that on winter evenings, these very beads can mirror the Pleiades, a respectable imitation given the budget. A younger listener wonders whether any star cluster could remind the shells of home. Across the threshold, the night air tastes faintly of sweetgrass and the structures of authority nations, clans, cousins. Jokes settle into their proper shelves, dusted and level. One could almost nap standing up, content to know the archive remains alphabetized by color, quietude, and cosmic coincidence. The scene slides, almost unnoticed, to the circle of 5 clan chiefs seated around the council fire, each of them pretending the flames are speaking first so no one has to interrupt. Their titles rustle like leaves: turtle, bear, wolf, plus 2 more animals that decline to be hurried, but introductions take less time than the thoughtful silences afterward. They hold polished antler pipes that never quite touch their lips, a ceremonial loophole for anyone counting puffs. Someone observes that, by comparison, modern conference calls are mostly awkward mutes punctuated by a chorus of, "Sorry, you go ahead." Here the apologies are older, deeper, and cushioned by protocol the way moss cushions a fallen pine. A small bowl of hominy makes the slow tour of the circle, grains swaying like drowsy fireflies. Each chief stirs the corn once, a gesture meaning, yes, we're still here, and also no, we will not expedite the agenda. The peacemaker's words drift between them, not spoken so much as remembered aloud, that the thickness of the agreement equals the thickness of the forest. Nobody asks who measured the forest. Instead, they offer a pledge that sounds like water rearranging itself over stones continuous, self-correcting, never in a hurry. If one listens long enough, the syllables almost repeat a joke about stubborn birches, but the punchline is muffled beneath another lap of hominy. A spark detaches, arcs upward, and retires as ash before it finds the roof. The circle respects its resignation with a microsecond of silence. Then someone recalls, almost whimsically, that in the 15th century a delegation once debated whether fish should have representation. Consensus: fish attend only when rivers flood, which is presumably often enough for aquatic opinions. The visitor from the Seneca side smiled thinly and carved the joke into a paddle, proving that humor, like policy, benefits from plaques. The flames sigh, the chiefs nod, and the night proceeds exactly one heartbeat slower, just to see if anyone complains. Now the talking embers lead us outside, beneath a white pine whose branches arrange themselves in layered peace signs. Here, the weapons lie buried, not merely stuck in the ground, but tucked away like toys from a finished game. Hatchet, spear, arrow, edge of obsidian dulled by ritual earth, each one sheathed in a silence so heavy it might qualify as geological. Legends say roots will wrap the blades to keep them from remembering their sharpness, the botanical equivalent of password protecting one's temper. Somewhere a cricket misreads the mood and chirps twice before reconsidering its resume. The burial mound is plain as a folded blanket, yet it marks the moment when diplomacy replaced renovation, tearing down old grudges, installing patience, patching the roof of the sky where storms once leaked through. Imagine a modern office. Memo announcing that staplers will henceforth be planted under a ficus to discourage passive aggression. The gesture would be similar, but the ficus would not grow to 60 meters, nor would eagles nest in its crown to supervise workplace harmony. One spearhead reportedly tried to sprout on its own, confused by metaphors, but the soil gently reminded it of retirement benefits, and the urge subsided. Stone-quiet minutes pass while moonlight combs the pine needles. Somewhere nearby, a child counts firefly flashes as if they were clauses to an invisible Treaty 1 glow for gratitude. 2 for caution, 3 for the right to correct an elder's math. The counting fades into a half-spoken lullaby about dates nobody wrote down, because accuracy sometimes spoils the dream. Even so, every buried blade carries the coordinates of its former anger, should anyone wish to revisit. They rarely do. Anger feels heavier when you have to dig it up first, and shovels, unlike opinions, prefer to sleep in. Dawn inches in like a guest who forgot whether breakfast was an invitation or a rumor. Mist slides across the lake, erasing the shoreline in slow strokes, and the first eagle cry locates the horizon the way a lone violin finds the key of an orchestra. Paddle strokes from an unseen canoe make a metronome that politely declines to keep strict time. On shore, the ashes of last night's council fire exhale a faint curl, a contented sigh of wood that found its purpose. Somewhere across the water, a loon laughs at nothing in particular, the stand-up comic of wetlands doing a set for an audience of cattails. Sunlight arrives in soft increments, examining each reed as though checking tickets. It pauses on the pine and lingers on the roots that keep their secret armory sealed. One might imagine the steel beneath warming slightly, though not enough to remember cutting, only enough to dream of usefulness redefined as sleeping peacefully forever. Near the shoreline, a beaver grates the dam with the seriousness of a medieval notary, finding it satisfactory but recommending an extra branch for aesthetic symmetry. If municipal building codes were enforced by beavers, most cities would look calmer and probably chew their stress into more manageable shapes. Air warms, but only the small animals notice. The people move slowly, sleeves brushing bark, eyes half-lidded against the rising gold. A woman recites the clans in a voice so slow it could be mistaken for drifting pollen. Turtle, bear, wolf, and the others, each syllable a raft taking its time across a mirrored surface. She adds that the Great Law insists on gratitude each morning, even if gratitude wakes up grumpy. Modern alarm clocks would benefit from that clause. Imagine a snooze button that told you gently, you may return to dreams, but first recall one. Kind thing. The clause is older than the button and kinder. Nothing concludes. The longhouse door still stands open. The pine still murmurs over quiet iron. The eagle circles once, then once again, reading the lake as though searching for the next paragraph. The wampum waits on its beam, catching daylight now, a revised constellation prepared to glow whenever dusk requests its company. Words drift on, softer each time, like pages set loose on a river that never bends sharply enough to disturb their slow spin. And if a listener drifts away before the next sentence settles, the beads will continue their silent conversation, unbothered by whether ears attend or eyelids fall, carrying the law forward one shimmer, one breath, one patient, unending pulse at a time. You might be surprised to learn that in the damp spring of 1784, a clerk in a chilly London office decided the nation's budget could be shored up by counting bricks, one by one, as though they were slow sheep crossing a stile at twilight. Numbers seemed harmless enough on parchment, yet elsewhere in Britain the idea fluttered outward like a bored moth and settled on every kill, turning warm stacks of clay into reluctant tax forms. Quiet chimneys exhaled their smoke in mildly disgruntled spirals, and masons found themselves consulting tables of rates instead of recipes for mortar, the way bakers might one day be forced to pay duties on the freckles of their loaves. If you're still awake when we reach the part about excise officers measuring brick cavities with pocket-sized calipers, you're welcome to subscribe. Though I suppose you could also let that thought drift past like faint dust from a newly struck trowel. Early collectors arrived with leather-bound ledgers and the serene patience of librarians. They tapped each brick, listening for hollowness, or worse, clever dents disguised under a film of slip. A fraudulent cavity was worth a polite fine, the monetary version of being told your hat was on backward by someone who cared just enough to take notes. Even then, some builders insisted the inspector's knock sounded flat, an ironic complaint given that flatness was the entire point. Among the more enterprising brickmakers was Joseph Wilkes of Measham, who reasoned that if the tax was charged by the brick rather than by its size, then the obvious answer was simply to make the bricks enormous. His jumbos, as they came to be whispered about in pub corners, were large enough to double as picnic stools, provided one didn't mind a slight scent of damp earth in the sandwiches. The law made no mention of maximum dimensions, perhaps, because no one in Parliament wished to imagine a house constructed out of single-story blocks. Carrying them required a patient horse or an impatient nephew. Lifting them demanded 2 hands, 3 if you counted a robust exhalation for moral support. The Treasury's solution was a schedule of escalating duties, a staircase of shillings that rose just fast enough to discourage excessive creativity, but not fast enough to stop the whispering. In a modest yard near Colchester, a foreman spent an entire afternoon drawing lines on a plank to identify the legal border between a tolerably taxed brick and an extravagantly taxed one. He labeled the plank somewhat expensive at one end and positively imprudent at the other, then used it as a makeshift shelf for his teacup, proving any tool will find its own retirement. Nearby, an apprentice calculated that each additional 1/8 of an inch in length increased the fee by roughly the price of a meat pie, or 2 if the pie was unusually optimistic about the density of its filling. The tax inspectors themselves developed a ritual rhythm: stride, pause, extract rule, measure, nod, record, and sometimes sneeze when red dust tickled the nostrils. Legends claim one officer mislaid his folding ruler inside a cooling clamp of bricks, only to retrieve it months later, perfectly encased like a fragile fossilized fern. He kept it on his mantelpiece to remind guests that bureaucracy has layers, quite literal ones, and can occasionally fire itself solid when nobody's watching. Dinner chatter afterward was said to be unusually quiet, everyone suddenly aware of the small, baked prisons their paperwork might one day inhabit. Brick color also entered the discussion, if only because people need something to debate gently, while kilns hum in the background. Paler Malm bricks, lighter in lime and easier on the purse, were taxed at a slightly higher rate, perhaps to discourage a fashionable monotony of facades. Builders protested that paying more for less. Pigment felt like being charged extra for filtered air, but the legislation was as unmoved as the bricks themselves. One steward wrote to his cousin claiming that Malm, sufficient red, and nearly terracotta had become the new political parties of his street, each loyal to its hue, each impermeable to persuasion beyond a fresh coat of lime wash. Somewhere outside, Wolverhampton, a modest cottage rose with curious asymmetry, because the owner alternated untaxed oversized bricks with taxed standard ones, like stripes on an indecisive badger. Visitors leaned sideways to admire it, unsure whether to compliment economy or question gravity. The mason, taking pride in the design's experimental aesthetic, declared that a house should feel mildly tipsy so its occupants could stay sober by comparison. No one bothered to contradict him. The tea was warm, the chimney drew well, and besides, it is difficult to debate architecture with someone holding a trowel in reflective silence. Travelers by stagecoach noted that piles of rejected bricks lined the highway ditches, each stamped "duty paid" in ink the rain could not wash out. Children stacked them into miniature forts, calling them Fort Finance and Fort Tedium, attacking one with pebbles when the other seemed lonely. A passing preacher used a brick as an impromptu pulpit, quoting from Ecclesiastes about seasons for every purpose, including, one presumed, the purpose of sitting down before the brick got any heavier. Even the horses appeared intrigued, though perhaps they simply enjoyed a surface that did not squish like the usual road after rain. Amid the thriving confusion, scholars of units of measure took the opportunity to publish pamphlets with breathtakingly slow titles, such as Observations upon the Variable Dimensions of Clay Articles Under Fiscal Constraint. In them, footnotes sprawled like ivy, explaining that a standard brick should occupy 105 cubic inches, unless it was 150 or unless it was Scottish, in which case one should consult a different pamphlet currently out of print. One author proposed that all bricks be issued tiny passports, stamped at each kill, so their journey from mud to mantle could be monitored for suspicious enlargement. The idea was praised for its thoroughness and promptly shelved for being heavier. Then the legislation it sought to clarify kill masters discovered that subtle changes in cooling time could make a brick shrink just enough to squeak under a higher tariff. They began timing firings by folk songs, reasoning that a verse about courting lasted longer than a verse about harvest, unless sung by someone in a hurry for supper. Vest's brick size came to depend on local accents and whether the tenor had recently cleared his throat. One batch cooled during a particularly enthusiastic rendition of Greensleeves, resulting in bricks so narrow they rattled in the palate like dice. The inspector, charmed by the reedy tune still echoing in the yard, let them pass with a shrug flavored by melody. Meanwhile, garden walls rose in whimsical curves because their constituent bricks varied like mismatched biscuits. A wall built. Behind a vicarage leaned left in the mornings and right by dusk, its mortar accommodating the sun's whim as politely as possible. The vicar declared it a moral lesson about compromise. Neighborhood cats declared it a climbing frame. The tax officer declared it statistically improbable and filed a report whose only comment in the margin read, "Gravity behaving unusually again." The report was archived between observations on tariff thatch and on the shrinkage of soap during Lent, neither of which has kept many readers awaked up by 1850 the government, perhaps exhausted by the paperwork or charmed by the nations. Expanding waistline of oversized clay repealed the brick tax entirely. Celebrations were modest, mostly people exhaling rather than cheering, and new kilns fired up with the enthusiasm of kettles invited back onto the stove. Standardization followed, though some builders clung sentimentally to their larger molds, the way one might keep an out-of-date calendar for its comfortable margins. Others broke the mold ceremonially and brewed tea in the fragments, claiming the flavor was earthy, fiscally liberated, and pleasantly tepid. Today, antique dealers sell jumbo bricks as doorstops, bookends, or philosophical conversation starters. A single block can prop open the heaviest Victorian sash window, which seems fitting for both artifacts recall drafts, one of wind, one of legislation no longer in force. Museums label them with placards so small they could rest inside. The old tax ink stamp, but rarely does a visitor linger long enough to read every line. Those who do may notice a faint ridge where the duty mark once sat, like a healed scar on soft bone, evidence that even clay remembers its brief burden of shillings. The kill fires of that era are quiet now, but on cool evenings some towns still carry the smell of warm brick dust, mingling with coal smoke and the slow rustle of ledgers asleep in their archives. Were you to press an ear to a surviving jumbo, you might hear nothing at all, or perhaps the distant murmur of inspectors counting in half-remembered units. One brick, one penny, one pause. The numbers drift away on the breeze, lighter than ash. Satisfied to have done their arithmetic and settled into silence, the way all taxes eventually wait for the twilight bell, then stop ringing altogether. You might find it gently surprising that in the autumn hush of 1793, Paris decided ordinary minutes were simply too predictable and tried to stretch a single day across 10 equal hours, as though time itself were soft dough on a well-floured countertop. The new decimal clocks ticked at an unfamiliar pace, hands drifting like unhurried dragonflies, and street-side passers-by paused to wonder whether they were early, late, or somehow both. If you're still awake once we wander into the matter of 12-day weeks and the perplexed roosters of rural Burgundy, you could always subscribe, though really there's no rush. These hours are unusually elastic. The law, written in crisp revolutionary ink, announced that each of the 10 fresh hours would blossom into 100 tranquil minutes, and every minute would unspool into 100 soft-footed seconds, none of which felt the need to hurry anywhere in particular. Artillery officers complained that noon now occurred at 4:30 by the old reckoning, which made aiming cannons feel less martial and more like debating poetry scansion. A modest clerk in the Ministry of Weights and Measures suggested, painting a polite line down the middle of each public clock face, left half for the familiar duodecimal day, right half for the daring decimal dawn. A compromise not unlike wearing one shoe from each pair to see which breaks in first. Manufacturers of watch springs discovered that dividing torsion by 10 required neither more nor less metal, only a cautiously optimistic instruction leaflet. One famous horologist from Besançon produced a pocket watch with 2 concentric dials, the inner whispering revolutionary time and the outer murmuring the stubborn old cadence. Owners reported that when the lid snapped shut, the hands briefly aligned in mutual bewilderment before returning to their separate philosophies, like roommates politely ignoring each other in a shared kitchen. The ticking, curiously, was a shade slower, almost meditative, as though the watch had taken up deep breathing. Outside the capital, farmers found themselves drafting decimal rosters for milking cows that declined to honor any schedule calculated in base 10. A certain obstinate Jersey heifer named Rosalie achieved minor notoriety by producing precisely 11.5 liters at the 9th revolutionary hour, causing a local pamphleteer to note that livestock possessed a natural resistance to abstract mathematics. Village bells, forged generations earlier to chime every quarter of an old-fashioned hour, now rang at in-between moments like paragraphs searching for their sentences. Pigeons roosting in the belfries took no notice. They divided the day strictly into seed time and contemplative staring. Meanwhile, in the smoky cafes along the Seine, Patrons glanced up at freshly repainted wall clocks, divided into 10 generous wedges, each wedge the hue of lukewarm chocolate, perhaps to soothe nervous tea drinkers. One mathematician observed that under the new scheme, an afternoon conversation could be recorded to the nearest centiminute, a unit that sounded alarmingly precise for gossip about pastry prices. He promptly timed the silence between bites of brioche and declared the result satisfyingly round, though his companion thought the phrase better suited to the brioche itself. Somewhere, a harpsichord player tried fitting a sonata into 10 parts. The coda wandered off, uncertain where to land, and chose to keep walking. Postal routes, already majestic in their unpredictability, gained a further flourish. Schedules printed. In decimal hours, confused stagecoach drivers who navigated by sun, wind, and the emotional state of their horses. One route from Lyon to Grenoble stated departure at 7th hour 72, a figure so symmetrical it felt decorative. Passengers waited in twilight with letters folded like cautious paper boats, trusting that eventually someone would remember which edition of the morning they occupied. An enterprising innkeeper began selling universal time soup, served whenever someone asked what time it was, which turned out to be often enough to sustain his broth. Back in Paris, the convention commissioned elegant public thermometers engraved in decimal degrees, lest the citizens grow chilly without the comfort of orderly fractions. Yet the mercury climbed and fell in its own sweet tempo, ignoring both politics and pedagogical zeal. Street artists sketched a sun wearing spectacles and shrugging at the numbers, a quiet satire that survived precisely 3 afternoons before rain smudged the ink into the appearance of thoughtful fog. A passerby remarked that even a blurred joke retains its punchline if nobody expects to laugh. Very hard. Calendar reform marched alongside the clocks, introducing 12 tranquil months of exactly 30 days each, plus a pocket full of leftover. Festivals at year's end like buttons collected after a nap. Weekends, renamed decades, arrived every 10th day, leading the other 9 to bivouac in patient formation. Bankers found themselves joyfully baffled by interest calculations, discovering that compound growth behaved like ivy willing to cling to any wall, decimal or otherwise. An accountant drafted a ledger with columns labeled day 3 at lunch, and night 7 just before tea, then concluded the safest investment was probably longer lunch dot in provincial classrooms. School children traced new timetables under the wary gaze of teachers who'd only recently mastered the old ones. Lessons began at what used to be 8:30, but now masqueraded as 2nd hour 38, a number the chalkboard seemed to resent. The multiplication tables, once cozy in base 12, attempted a somersault into base 10 and landed politely on their backs. A small boy named Etienne asked whether bedtime would also arrive later, given the extended minutes. The teacher, paused deep in arithmetic uncertainty, murmured that sleep observes no legislature, and suggested Etienne find empirical evidence that evening dot printers of almanacs thrived. Each edition contained dual columns, one for sunrise and Republican time, the other for sunrise and yesterday's time, both printed in typeface so tiny that a magnifying glass came free with purchase. A rumor emerged of a degenerate served exactly at 50 Republican minutes past the 5th hour, which translated to a traditional 9:40-something, depending on whose spectacles one borrowed. Cafe owners solved the issue by offering breakfast. Whenever someone looked capable of buttering bread without assistance, a metric more reliable than any clock devised. Yet, as seasons drifted, the decimal project softened. Public enthusiasm settled like flour on a countertop, noticeable but rarely stirred. By 1795, most workshops discreetly unscrewed the experimental dials, returning to the familiar 12-petal faces, though a few sentimental taverns kept their 10-pointed stars nailed above the door as conversation pieces. One elderly patron liked to toast the forgotten seconds, raising a glass of watered wine at the very moment neither system cared to acknowledge a temporal cul-de-sac. Perfect for small wishes. No one quite recalled whether he chose the moment for its symbolism or simply because it fell between rounds. Collectors today occasionally find a dusty decimal pocket watch in an attic drawer, its hand stalled at an ambiguous ninth hour, the spring eager but unable to recall which century's tempo to obey. Wind it, and the tick resumes, sounding like footsteps on a corridor that veers ever so slightly to the left. Museums place them behind glass beside interpretive cards, longer than the brief experiment itself, while visitors nod as if comprehending the distance between 99 and 100 in a heartbeat. Some think they hear a faint echo of that. Elongated day, stretching like a cat, unconcerned by the customary bell. If you linger by the banks of the Seine at dusk, when the sky divides itself into easy fractions, 1 part lavender, 9 parts fading gold, you might fancy the river keeping decimal time, its current slipping past in orderly tense. A boatman adjusts his oars without looking at any watch, measuring distance the way a dream measures narrative, neither strictly correct nor enthusiastically wrong. Somewhere a bell rings the old half-hour, comfortable as a yawn, and a dog decides to ignore it with professional dedication. Moments fold inside each other, like envelopes addressed to centuries that never quite learned one another's alphabet, and so the experiment rests quietly in the archives, a pocket of days where hours stretched and numbers rearranged themselves into polite rows. The papers still smell faintly of ink and winter coal, a perfume of bureaucracy that puts even seasoned researchers in a yawning mood. We could, I suppose, calculate what time it would be right now under the Republican scheme, perhaps 6th hour 85. Give or take an abstract notion, but it seems friendlier to let the idea drowse, the way a cat curls on a windowsill, and forgets its precise longitude. Time, decimal or otherwise, will keep breathing at its chosen pace, soft and unhurried, willing to carry your thoughts downstream until even arithmetic closes its eyes and drifts. You might not expect a modest squiggle of white paint on a London doorway to keep the city from stumbling over its own shoelaces, yet there it sits, calmly announcing number 5, while pigeons offer faint applause from the gutters. If you're still conscious by the time we drift past the controversy over whether sevens should sport a jaunty crossbar, feel free to subscribe. Though honestly, no one will check the guest list. The year is 1767, the river smells of soggy toast, and Parliament has recently decided that houses should stop hiding behind fanciful names like Rose Cottage and start lining up and tidy, arithmetic, as though streets were taking attendance at an exceptionally slow school. Painters set out at dawn with brushes wagging like sleepy foxtails, dipping them into pots the color of clotted cream. They dab each numeral with priest-like care, because a crooked 3 can misdirect an entire mail sack, and nobody wants to read someone else's bill for beeswax candles. Residents peer through cracked shutters, measuring the digits as though they were fortune tellers reading door frames instead of palms. One lady complains that the number 9 resembles a startled hedgehog. The painter, too polite to mention the hedgehog's limited options, adds an extra curl and calls it fashion. Somewhere down the terrace, a cat ponders whether the number on its own collar ought to match the one appearing above the milkman's knock. Administrative harmony being a cat's secret hobby. By midsummer, wooden numerals give way to hammered. Tin plaques in theory more durable, in practice noisier, clinking like very small cymbals whenever the wind rehearses a sonata. Blacksmiths discover the subtle difficulty of coaxing iron into the shape of a graceful 2 without accidentally producing a melancholy swan. They file the edges, sneeze rust, and hang the digits under lamp brackets with nails long enough to worry any passing specter of good taste. Inspectors in stovepipe hats pace the sidewalks, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. Yes, still 3. Absolutely 3, an echoing chant that convinces local dogs they're being taught. Arithmetic in exchange for patient silence. Clerks at the General. Post office, delightfully overwhelmed, invent directories so thick they could prop open the Thames floodgates. Each page records a house number, a street name, and occasionally a helpful margin note such as front step wobbles. Copyists dip quills, sip ink by accident, and debate whether no. 87 billion deserves a comma or counseling. A junior scribe proposes that sub-basement flats be labeled with negative integers, a suggestion received with the respectful hush usually reserved for rain at funerals. Across town, messengers fold the new lists into their hats like origami umbrellas, convinced the numbers breed overnight, multiplying in alleys where mathematics was previously unknown. As autumn fog settles, lamplighters fan out with poles topped by little cups of flame, tipping fire into glass globes that blink awake one by one. The fresh street numbers glow in the lantern light, acquiring halos of soot and gentle authority. Residents strolling after supper can now locate Aunt Dorcas promptly, sparing phosphorescent shoelaces the indignity of further testing. A philosopher, leaning on a railing, observes that numbering houses is rather like assigning page numbers to clouds comforting, fatally absurd, and destined to be ignored by anyone determined to dream instead. The philosopher's companion is unsure whether this counts as a witticism, but nods politely until both remarks and railing fade into the larger hush of evening dawn over the winter. Snow softens every numeral into marshmallow silhouettes. Even the sternest fours adopt a wintry plumpness. Children discover that licking a tin zero in February makes the tongue momentarily bilingual. Postmen trudge past in capes that smell of wool and fortnight-old gossip, matching addresses to packages. With the solemn glee of matchmakers, one parcel, addressed only to the third brightest window on Bishopsgate, is gently redirected to number 112, whose landlord accepts it with the weary grace of a man accustomed to poetic detours. He later discovers the box contains precisely one shoe buckle left not by mistake, but, as the attached note concedes, for future reference. Spring mud splashes the lower halves of every digit, so that 8s appear to be standing in communal baths. A committee of shopkeepers proposes raising the plaques 3 inches, citing both hygiene and improved legibility for unhurried horses. Carpenters oblige, drilling new holes while sparrows pass judgment from door lintels. During one particular languid afternoon, a sparrow drops a feather that lands gently on the wet paint of a freshly refreshed 6. The feather dries in place, giving the number a fashionable sideburn admired by exactly 3 pedestrians before it is politely brushed away by city maintenance, who claim no feather has the right of permanent decorative residence. Years slip by. Door numbers fade to a comforting gray, like old ledger ink after a rainstorm of sighs. Replacement schemes involve enamel plaques in colors described as evening drizzle, ordered in bulk from a factory whose chief interest is coaxing metal into shapes that resist both weather and unsolicited philosophy. The enamel, slightly glossy, reflects morning sunlight into narrow hallways where coats wait patiently on pegs. A visiting aunt mistakes her nephew's house for the one next door, thanks to an enthusiastic vine that has embraced both numerals with equal affection. Tea is served anyway, because nothing in the numbering act forbids hospitality based on botanical enthusiasm. Eventually, the Postal Service observes that misdeliveries have declined to tolerable murmurs, and Parliament moves its attention to more pressing matters, such as regulating the correct curvature of cucumber barrels. Yet the house numbers remain, quietly policing themselves. When a digit loosens, a neighbor taps it back into alignment with the handle of an umbrella, satisfied to contribute to municipal geometry. Cracks in the paint become small biographies, recounting decades of drizzle, chimney soot, and the delicate abrasion of weekly dusters. Even burglars, rumor has it, appreciate a clearly labeled entrance, finding the crisp contrast between duty and mischief oddly soothing. On foggy nights, a carriage might rattle down the cobblestones as its driver peers at the dim numerals, aligning lantern glow with bespoke mathematics. Passengers inside yawn at the precise moment the carriage halts before number 137, though one persists in insisting they had requested 173. The driver, unwilling to argue with either integers or investors, circles the block until both statements are simultaneously true according to the time-honored principle of letting sleepiness decide. Meanwhile, the numerals wait unchanged, unhurried, willing to be wrong or right depending on who asks, and how gently dot modern refurbishments add sleek aluminum digits. Crisp as breakfast toast, yet the old signs often stay nailed just above, like grandparent silhouettes overlooking new generations. Delivery drones occasionally misread the overlapping indices, hovering uncertainly before depositing packages on whichever stoop seems most philosophical about cardboard. Inside, someone dozing by the parlor fire half hears the soft thud and assumes the house has coughed politely. They make a note to investigate at some juncture, defined less by clocks and more by the eventual cooling of their T-dot, so the numbers linger, painted, plated, enameled, updated, overlapped, and occasionally sung about by milkmen who need an octave to remember their route. They are small guardians of location, content to sit domestically above brass knockers and dried lavender wreaths, marking the narrow threshold between lost and found. And if the digits chip or tilt or fade into the same pewter color as distant thunder, they still whisper coordinates to anyone with patience enough to listen. The street keeps breathing slow arithmetic, counting doorways the way an insomniac counts half-imagined sheep, until even numbers themselves feel drowsy, their edges rounding in the night air, content to watch eyelids grow heavier, heavier, and softly heavier still. You might not think a faint ribbon of warm tallow could keep the British Treasury aglow. Yet in the still damp spring of 1709, that very ribbon, cooled, cut, and casually called a candle, became a polite source of revenue, flickering over ledgers while chimney swifts traded gossip in the soot. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about inspectors lowering little brass spoons into molten wax, to be sure no one was hiding untaxed lumens under the surface, feel free to subscribe. Though please don't scorch your thumb. Hunting for the button, Parliament's new duty taxed candles by the pound and by the maker, demanding that every chandler register affix lead seals, and promise on moderately crumpled parchment that no wick would wander into existence without a fee attached. Housewives, suddenly promoted to amateur accountants, counted tapers like slow sheep, one for the scullery, one for the stairs, perhaps a half rank for emergencies involving mysterious bumps behind the pantry door. Somewhere near Shrewsbury, a diligent vicar reputedly catalogued his parish's candle consumption in the margin of every sermon, producing a yearly stack of homilies that smelt faintly of theology and melted fat. Licensed chandlers hung their certificates beside the curing. Racks, the paper curling in heat as if trying to emulate the candles themselves. Apprentices cut wicks to the legal maximum thickness, which inspectors measured with calipers, so dainty they could double as lobster picks at a particularly thrifty supper. A crooked wick, they warned, burned with an extravagance unbecoming to patriotic illumination. One apprentice swore he could hear the tallow sigh whenever the gauge approached, the way a cat sighs at the sight of an empty saucer. No one bothered to contradict him. Sighs were untaxable, at least for now. Rushlights, slender reeds dipped in leftover grease, enjoyed a quiet renaissance among frugal households. They produced more smoke than shine, painting ceilings the color of weak coffee and encouraging spiders to reconsider interior design. Still, they evaded duty, and evasion has its own charm. A pamphleteer suggested flavoring rushlights with lavender to offset the smell. The result, witnesses claimed, was a room that smelt like a perfumed barnyard, half unpleasant, half oddly nostalgic. Modern scented candles owe them no debt, though they might. If nostalgia ever accrues interest, inspectors traveled with portable scales, delicate enough to weigh conscience, if conscience came in handy quarter-ounce portions. They knocked at cottage doors, announcing themselves with the gravity of minor planets, then requested to see all tallow presently under jurisdiction. One elderly widow arranged her candles on the table like chess pieces and invited the inspector to play. After 7 hesitant moves, he conceded both the game and the duty, choosing diplomacy over checkmate. The record shows a small deduction for confusion whilst contemplating strategy, a line item later scratched out by someone who preferred clarity and bureaucracy, even if not in chess. Urban evasion grew more imaginative. A Soho chandler offered invisible candles, little more than scraps of twisted rags sold with a wink and the advice to burn them only in absolute darkness, where their efficiency could not be disputed. Customers, pleased by the philosophical elegance, paid mostly for the story, which, being intangible, remained cheerfully outside the tax bracket. The Treasury, unable to audit metaphors, shrugged with dignified perplexity and raised the duty instead, hoping real candles would shoulder the additional burden without sputtering. Shipping crates of wax, required customs seals stamped with a neat impression of Britannia resting on a beehive, perhaps to remind everyone that industry was sweetest when supervised. Dockworkers learned to tap each cask and listen for the hollow plink that betrayed secret cavities stuffed with untaxed lights. One crate, legend says, answered with the gentle thrum of a contraband mandolin rather than candle ends. The foreman, charmed, let it pass, remarking that music makes a lighter world and therefore, by warped logic, owes lighter duty. Country fairs took advantage of loopholes by selling candle kits, wicks tied with ribbons, molds fashioned from pewter, and a ladle for melting fat of your own, free of direct taxation. Demonstrators performed leisurely pours, assuring onlookers that an evening spent coaxing tallow to behave like water is an evening too occupied to notice politics. Some customers discovered that patience cooled before the wax did. Unfinished. Candles slumped like sleepy macaroni, illuminating very little but teaching in their failure. A quiet lesson about economy and heat. By 1784. The duty had climbed so high that even fashionable drawing rooms grew dim. Hosts compensated with mirrored sconces, arranging them to multiply whatever light dared appear. Guests admired their reflections, while pretending not to count the candles themselves, which might seem gauche, like tallying how many times one has politely laughed in an hour. A diarist attending such a soiree noted that conversation fluttered in the half-gloom like moths rehearsing etiquette, a line so content with itself it received more light than the guest. Contraband tallow traveled at night, on slow wagons padded with straw to muffle the clink of illicit molds. Way station keepers brewed tea strong enough to varnish the memory of any footprints left by inspectors. In parish lore, a moonlit loading mishap once scattered candles across a turnip field. By morning, the farmer found his crops crowned with small pale hats, a sight so absurd the inspector arriving later dismissed it as a hallucination induced by fresh air. The farmer, not wishing to contradict government medicine, coughed appreciatively and offered a sampled turnip as proof of good health. Tax stamps changed design with every parliament, partly to thwart forgers, partly to employ engravers who enjoyed drawing tiny lions holding candles the way lions rarely do. Collectors today prize the 1815 issue, where the line's expression is said to betray sympathy for anyone reading by a single flame. Forgers reproduced the image with passable accuracy but could never mimic the faint melancholy in its eyes, proving that sadness is hard to fake at scale. Relief finally arrived in 1831, when the duty was repealed with a sigh almost audible through the House of Commons' thick velvet curtains. Chandlers rang handbells in the streets, an irony not lost on passers-by who considered bells a more efficient light source than previous evening's meager stubs. Candle prices dropped like tired shoulders, and households celebrated by burning. Two at once, luxuriating in the extravagance of shadows crisply outlined instead of muddled. One poet claimed a sudden brightness revealed corners of rooms he had never met. He introduced himself politely and found them shy but accommodating. Decades later, kerosene lamps strolled in, followed by electricity, both untaxed at first because nobody had the energy to imagine a levy on something so novel. Candles retreated to ceremonial niches, birthday cakes, and the personal toolkit of romance. Yet, if you lift an old brass candlestick, you may still see the tiny hole where it led. Seal once pinned legality to the metal. The hole is empty now, a perfect circle of historical exhalation, reminding the holder that light was once counted, weighed, licensed, and morally inspected before it could dance on a wall. Some evenings, when clouds blanket the sky just thickly, enough to persuade lampposts to wake early, you can almost sense the ghosts of inspectors prowling for illicit glimmers. They pause at windows, noses near the glass, squinting to judge whether a flame burns too proudly. But modern bulbs confuse them. They cannot measure a filament with calipers, nor find a diode for lavish brightness. So they drift away, footsteps, fading like the last curl of a snuffed wick, leaving the room to its comfortable glow and you to your comfortable drowsing, until even the idea of taxes, wicks, and sighs softens into the darkness and quietly, kindly goes out. You might not expect a perfectly ordinary forest fern to spark the gentle rearrangement of Victorian parlors. Yet one damp Thursday in 1855, a postal invoice for a Wardian case, essentially a miniature, glass nursery with brass feet slightly. $2,000 for the task set half of London, quietly buzzing about fronds instead of finances. If you're still awake once we reach the incident of Lord Petherington attempting to classify his own eyebrows with a botanist's lens, feel free to subscribe though. The button will remain exactly where you left it, unfurling no faster than a sleepy fiddlehead. The first cautious enthusiasm began in suburban drawing rooms, where mahogany sideboards were politely nudged aside to accommodate wide-bottomed jars of soil, each topped by a dome clear enough to magnify the humblest leaflet into faint green stained glass. Visitors whispered that you could practically hear the photosynthesis if you pressed an ear to the glass, a claim never conclusively proven because pressing one's ear against anything in polite company risked rumpling the drapes of dignity. Evening conversation slowed to the tempo of capillary action. Was the Polypodium aureum more restful to watch than the Aetherium filix femina? Or did they both deliver equal portions of botanical lullaby if viewed at arm's length? Someone proposed timed observation sessions, gazing for exactly 9 minutes, then blinking with ceremony, lest the plants feel scrutinized. The minutes ticked by, patient as moss stopped soon. Fern-collecting societies multiplied like spores on a breeze. Their charters included phrases such as the promotion of peaceful fround appreciation and the exchange of delicately labeled rootstock by parcel post. Postage payable on silence. Meetings began with a soft clink of teacups and an even softer rustle as members unveiled books, trimmed in ribbon for cataloging the precise angle at which each leaflet drooped. One clerical gentleman drew tiny couches beside his sketches, so he could imagine the ferns reclining between observations. No one minded. Imaginings like carbon dioxide are freely exhaled and rarely taxed. By late summer, the railway timetables grew fluent in fern Latin. Noting stops convenient for snipping. Osmunda ricalis with minimal drama. Excursionists trundled along trackside hedgerows and bonnets, brandishing trowels so dainty they could double as dessert spoons. Whenever a locomotive's whistle interrupted the silence, collectors paused, lifted their spoons in a gesture of greenhouse salute, and returned to whispering encouragement to the soil. Legends say one porter at Tunbridge Wells stationed himself as guardian of the fronds, though his main duty appeared to be reminding day trippers that ferns prefer shade more than applause. The reminder, offered hourly, was filed under public service dot in town. Shop front windows competed to display the most languid terraria. A particularly esteemed emporium arranged its boarding cases in descending size so that passers-by could watch. The light diminished leaf by leaf, like a gradual eclipse of busy thoughts. Children pressed noses against the glass until steam blurred both fern and reflection, transforming the entire scene into a green-tinged fog bank where patience floated. Contentedly, behind the counter, clerks wrapped parcels of spore-bearing fronds in paper printed with cautionary verses. "Handle me gently lest dreams scatter," which customers misread as marketing, but the clerks insisted was simply botany wearing poetic. Slippers dot the Royal Botanic Society, never one to overlook calm excitement, established a register of particularly handsome specimens. The register was handwritten in sloping ink and weighed just enough to discourage swift page turning. Each entry described the plant's height in inches, its temperament in metaphors, and occasionally its relationship to drafty windowsills. Specimen number 42 was listed as prefers dialogues about rainfall, tolerates opera if sung softly. Scholars visiting the library found themselves nodding along, as though the parchment were reading them in return. And so, an afternoon, examination easily slipped into evening reverie. Outside, the gas lamps came on with a sigh, illuminating the pages from a polite distance. A secondary wave of enthusiasm appeared in stationery cabinets, where new hues of green ink claimed to match particular chlorophyll tones. Correspondence between collectors achieved such fidelity that one recipient swore the letter was photosynthesizing in his vest pocket. He placed it by the window for moral support, prompting the local postman to inquire whether stamps should now include watering instructions. The Postmaster General, after brief contemplation, declared moisture antithetical to glue and left the matter to natural selection. Inevitably, the country estates joined the quiet parade. Conservatories overflowed with specimens arranged by the generous gradient of frond fringe. Guests arriving for weekend visits were given lorgnettes engraved with the suggestion to focus, not on the horizon, but on the fine hairs along the rachis of a polystichum setiferum. These hairs, the house steward claimed, resembled miniature violin bows mid-waltz, drawing out a symphony only the dust motes could hear. No record remains of anyone nodding in disagreement, though several visitors apparently nodded in near-dash sleep dot as winter dusk settled earlier each afternoon. Enthusiasts debated the ethics of artificial warmth. One camp favored coal-fired stoves placed discreetly behind frosted panes. The other preached resilience, arguing that a fern slightly chilled develops character akin to a person who forgets their gloves, yet survives the tram ride with stoic whimsy. The debate wore on slowly, cushioned by knitted shawls and scones that cooled at an equally academic pace. Ultimately, both factions agreed to test their theories by observing which plants drooped first. Results were inconclusive, as most observers nodded off mid-experiment, notebooks slipping to carpets patterned in sleepy paisley dot. Meanwhile, taxonomy advanced at a deliberate crawl. Scientists proposed names so elongated they looped around the margin, each Latin syllable like a lullaby syllable dressed in classical robes. One article in the Quarterly Fern Review described a newly identified hybrid whose only distinguishing feature was a polite reluctance to unfurl before Tuesday. The footnotes ran longer than the body text, containing cautious jokes about calendrical botany and the possibility of plants observing weekends. Readers reported feeling comfortably uninformed by the end, which the editor insisted signified success. The Wardian case manufacturers, sensing infinite demand, introduced models shaped like miniature bandstands, pagodas, even a respectable imitation of the Crystal Palace, scaled down so tiny that visitors had to kneel to glimpse the fern inside. Kneeling, it turned out, promoted reflective breathing. So customers lingered, inhaling deliberately, exhaling more deliberately, and purchasing cases by the trio so they could rotate them like slow-moving planets on a walnut side table. One lady claimed the arrangement improved the circulation of both air and conversation, though she admitted the latter still meandered primarily toward Mossdot by spring's return. Spore packets mailed during the winter thawed in postal depots, releasing an innocent dust that tempted clerks to sneeze in polite succession. An enterprising depot manager penned a circular instructing staff to handle parcels of delicate green sneeze powder with gloves, lest we inadvertently seed a library. The circular itself, printed on pale celery-colored paper, became collectible among enthusiasts. Some framed it beside their ferns, arguing that context enriches chlorophyll. Others pressed it flat under flower vases, where it quietly apprenticed in the art of patient weight dash, bearing public fascination peaked with the staging of the great provincial frond exhibition, held in a pavilion that smelled faintly of wet slate and distant applause. Rows of ferns occupied plinths numbered in Roman numerals that nobody hurried to translate. Visitors drifted like slow-motion moths, pausing to admire dew spritzed on leaves by attendants with atomisers disguised as quill pens. An award was bestowed upon the most contemplative specimen, judged by how long it convinced viewers they were about to recall an important memory, only to find the thought pleasantly evaporated. The winning fern received a ribbon embroidered with even smaller ferns and the Latin phrase for gentle persistence. Not long after, the fad softened. Enthusiasts quietly redirected their attention to seaweeds, meteorological kites, or the soothing discipline of measuring silence in seconds. Yet the ferns did not complain. They continued unfurling at a pace immune to fashion. Wardian cases migrated to attics, their brass hinges dozing, while the plants themselves sometimes escaped through forgotten vents, colonizing roof gutters and reminding shingles that life favors corners as well as forests. Postal ledgers still kept a column for botanical parcels, but the ink dried lighter each quarter, as though echoing the subtle green it once enumerated. Today, if you visit a second-hand bookshop and flip to the back of a Victorian fern guide, you may discover a pressed specimen flattened like a sigh between pages of Latin and longing. Hold it up to the light and you might see the faint outline of fingers that placed it there, careful not to bruise the edges of sleep. Nothing melts quite so gently as a memory of chlorophyll. The leaf remains, but only barely, a whisper of green. In paper that has long since decided to doze. Replace the page, close the cover, and feel an infinitesimal puff of air, perhaps the last breath of an entire quiet era slipping by, patient as a spore drift on a yawn. And so the fern craze rests, not extinct, merely out of fashion, like a clock whose hands have chosen to pause rather than break. Somewhere a conservatory door creaks, a single frond tilts toward the draft with unhurried curiosity, and the evening resumes its soft shuffle. If your eyelids feel a touch heavier now, imagine a Wardian case glowing gently in moonlight, glass fogging as inside a tiny forest rehearses dawn. The leaflets count each second by unfolding the smallest possible amount, and time obliges by slowing to match their rhythm until, at last, both plant and watcher drift comfortably into the same patient lull. You might not expect a row of nearly microscopic holes to decide the tempo of a continent's correspondence. Yet on a gray Tuesday in 1854, a clerk at Somerset House leaned closer to the light and declared that the British one-penny stamp should be perforated at exactly 15 holes to the inch, no more. No less envelopes everywhere forget how to breathe. If you're still awake by the time I reach the cheerful argument about whether 14.5 might be spiritually tidier, feel free to subscribe, though please don't trouble your eyelids with precision. They are already practicing it on your behalf. At first the perforations were done with a shy little machine that punched each sheet the way a sparrow pecks breadcrumbs, patient, approximate, faintly apologetic. Printers inspected the rows like garden fences, counting gaps to be sure no ambitious tooth tried to slip an extra smile between neighbors. One operator swore he could hear the paper sigh each time the pens descended, the way a well-mannered guest breathes out before sitting on a fragile chair. No one doubted him. Sighs, after all, are quieter than miscellane postage. Soon collectors began measuring the holes with brass gauges shaped like pocket telescopes, sliding them over stamps in slow motion as if stargazing across a miniature perforated galaxy. The official description, perforation gauge 15, rested happily in catalogs, while field gossip proposed that gauge 14 might allow letters to arrive fractionally sooner, like shoes with slightly shorter laces. Experiments ensued. 2 identical missives posted to Aberdeen, one in daring gauge 14.5, the other in orthodox gauge 15. Both arrived on the same Thursday afternoon, but enthusiasts claimed the rebellious specimen looked marginally more refreshed. As though enjoying looser trouser cuffs during the journey, arguments fluttered through philatelic societies with the determination of moths pursuing lamplight. Members arrived at meetings armed with magnifiers, sugar biscuits, and the conviction that decimal fractions could soothe the Royal Mail. Papers were read aloud at a pace considered safe for digestion, on the aerodynamics of microperforation. In humid weather, a brief reflection on tooth depth as moral indicator, and the perennial favorite, will postman notice? The last provoked an entire evening of contemplative silence, broken only when someone proposed inviting a postman to testify. The proposal failed because no one could agree how many holes should adorn the invitation. Meanwhile, machines improved. The old Sparrow model retired, replaced by a treadle-driven contraption that perforated sheets with the brisk confidence of a marching band tapping snare drums. Its inventor insisted on oiling every joint with lavender wax to keep the rhythm dignified. Visitors to the print works reported the air smelled of stationery and polite perfume, an aroma that lingered on outgoing letters like a distant ant's hug. One batch of stamps emerged with teeth so evenly spaced that clerks compared them to piano keys, though the tune, they admitted, was best attempted in whispers. Colonial offices adopted their own gauges, citing regional humidity, paper heft, and the philosophical climate. New South Wales preferred 11 3/4, while Cape Colony flirted with 12 before committing to 12 and a bit, a dimension recorded in ledgers as sufficiently companionable. Explanatory leaflets crossed oceans reminding printers not to confuse the imperial inch with the colonial inch, a distinction most clearly articulated via diagrams of very small rulers wearing different hats. Captains reading the leaflets at sea often folded them into paper boats, demonstrating that theory floats just as well as aspirin if you are particular. Back in Britain, the Postmaster General received polite petitions from towns that feared inconsistency might embolden forgers. A particularly cautious vicar in Dorset offered a sermon, comparing imperfect perforations to moral fraying, first a tiny mispunch, then anarchy in the vestry. Parishioners nodded while discreetly examining their correspondence for signs of libertine spacing. One elderly lady found a horizontal row listing lazily downhill, declared it a wandering tooth, and placed it between Bible pages for rehabilitation. The stamp appeared no straighter when later retrieved, but she claimed its disposition had improved. Manufacturers of measuring devices capitalized on the anxiety by producing pocket gauges engraved with decorative ivy, encouraging hobbyists to treat each stamp like a gentle puzzle piece. A deluxe model including a fold-out brass monocle promised accuracy to 1/20th of a hole, and came packaged with a velvet pouch scented faintly of arithmetic. Reviews in the monthly philatelist praised its heft, noting that serious study should always weigh slightly more than a slice of fruitcake. So the scholar notices when it slips into a trouser pocket and attempts escape. Railway stations, newly alive with telegram clatter. Hired clerks whose entire duty was to tear panes of stamps along perforation lines before sale. They developed almost musical timing: thumb, twist, pull, release. One clerk in York boasted he could separate a sixpence strip with his eyes closed while identifying engine whistles by region. Observers rarely challenged him. Watching the paper divide so neatly felt oddly reassuring, like hearing rain hit a roof you do not need to fix. On quieter shifts, he practiced tearing alternative gauge sheets, claiming it built spiritual ambidexterity. Test laboratories, curious about durability, suspended halfpenny lilac stamps in breezy corridors, counting hours until the teeth surrendered. To draft-born flutters, results were inconclusive. Some stamps held for days, others let go at lunchtime, apparently craving adventure in the postal sack. A technician suggested feeding them lukewarm tea to boost morale, a concept rejected, on budgetary grounds. Nevertheless, rumors persisted that stamps performed better when spoken to kindly during drying. An early exploration into administrative psychology. The turning point arrived with the discovery that singeing could seal the tiny fibers around each hole, preventing rogue tears. Trials involved wafting sheets over an alcohol lamp, producing a scent halfway between toasted bread and faint alarm. Supervisors monitored flame angles with protractors designed for geometry lessons, thus uniting mathematics and punctuality in a single waft of smoke. Some printers claimed the stamps emerged browner, others saw no change, and a few simply enjoyed having an excuse to hold fire near paperwork with official blessing dot by the 1890s. A committee convened to rationalize gauges across the empire, proposing an elegant average, 13.2. The number pleased nearly everyone, chiefly because it implied the committee had thought about decimals without blaming them. Pamphlets printed in dove-gray ink explained the new standard, urging patience during the perforatory transition. Enthusiasts felt nostalgic already, arranging farewell parties for gauge 15, complete with tiny paper bunting cut from misprints. Guests toasted the past with lemonade served in thimbles so as not to overwhelm adjacency. Collectors today still search for transitional sheets, bearing mixed perforations, a row of 14 facing down a row of 15, like neighbors discussing. Fence height over chamomile tea. Prices rise modestly at auction, not for rarity but for the soothing symmetry of compromised enthusiasm. One cannot help admiring how paper pins, and a preference for neat tiding push civilization fractionally forward, a progress measurable only if you own the correct little ruler, and even then only if you squint dot, if at this late hour you find your thoughts drifting into those narrow spaces between the holes. Feel free to let them rest there. Imagine a soft procession of stamps gliding past, guided by pinprick constellations. Each tooth a quiet declaration that separation, too, can be gentle. The clerk at Somerset House, the treadle machine, the cautious vicar, and the brass gauge enthusiasts all fade into the background hum, leaving only the subtle rhythm of paper accepting its boundaries. Letters fold, lamps dim, and the night sorts itself into even rows, perforated just enough for dreams to tear free and wander on their own. light as canceled ink, steady as sleep. You might not expect the exact width of a wooden slat on a Parisian park bench to influence the tempo of afternoon gossip. Yet, in the drizzle-damp spring of 1889, the prefecture quietly decreed that every new bench along the boulevards should contain precisely 7 slats, each shaved to 5 1/8 centimeters, so the city's many coats and conversation topics would rest at a uniform incline. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where inspectors compare varnish sheen to lukewarm cafe au lait, feel free to subscribe, though really, do keep your hands in your lap. The benches have no opinion about algorithms. The earliest models, painted a shade of municipal green somewhere between laurel leaf and politely watered absinthe, arrived with iron feet that curled like sleepy question marks. Workers unloaded them before dawn, aligning them shoulder to shoulder, so methodically that passers-by suspected choreography. One carpenter claimed the slats gave a satisfied thunk when screwed into place, like books reshelving themselves after. Midnight. His apprentice nodded, noting each gap with a thin brass ruler engraved on one side with Paris and on the other with patience. They discovered that a gap wider than 2 thumb widths encouraged gloves to disappear forever. Any narrower left crumbs with no dignified escape route. Thus the bench became custodian to a very small yet influential geography of lost buttons. By midsummer, the regulation bench, as newspapers dubbed it, gently multiplied along the Seine. Older benches, still lounging under horse chestnuts in mismatched groups of 5 or 9 slats, looked suddenly informal, like relatives who had forgotten the dress code. Retirees relocated their chessboards to the newer seats, explaining that the 7th slat provided a strategic psychological horizon. Pawns, apparently, advance with more confidence when their generals sit at mathematically pleasant heights. Pigeons agreed by approximation, alighting to peck at imaginary diagonals before drifting off to supervise pastry crumbs. Somewhere near the Pont Neuf, a civil servant spent 3 evenings timing how long each species, human, avian, or pastry crumb, remained undisturbed on a regulation surface. His notes survive mostly as smudges, but the conclusion appears to be long enough to reconsider tomorrow. When autumn leaves began rehearsing their quiet descent, the prefecture issued a supplement clarifying varnish. Each slat must receive exactly 2 coats, no fewer, lest the grain rise in humid weather and protest by snagging silk petticoats. Painters approached the task like monks illuminating manuscripts, whispering gently to the wood as the brush passed. One insisted the varnish smelled of roasted chestnuts disguised as bureaucracy. Another thought it more like distant violin rosin. Either way, stray cats passing underneath emerged with glossy whiskers, newly certificated by municipal happenstance. A letter to Le Figaro suggested awarding the cats honorary bench numbers, but the editor let the idea fall softly between paragraphs, where most ideas dream themselves thin. Inspectors followed, carrying pocket thermometers to ensure the varnish dried within the comfort window of 15 to 21 degrees Celsius. A range chosen, some joked, because it suited the inspector's own scarves. They tapped each slat with small wooden mallets to confirm structural humility. A dull thud indicated cooperative fibers. A bright pong suggested ambition and warranted a discreet extra nail. Residents strolling past often mistook the tapping for distant metronomes and slowed their steps accordingly, which, in a roundabout way, prevented collisions at busy corners. Urban rhythm, like music, can hinge on notes no one remembers hearing. Winter crept in wearing its usual frost feather boa. Snow settled on the benches, outlining every gap with sugared geometry, so that from a distance the rows resembled long arithmetical problems gently awaiting solutions. Street sweepers, armed with straw brooms, brushed the accumulation into neat windrows, revealing how the 7th slat shed flakes faster than its sisters, perhaps a design quirk, perhaps sheer conversational charm. A chocolatier near the Jardin. Drew Luxembourg swore that couples seated on regulation benches bought more hot cocoa than those perched on antique ones, speculating that standardized comfort left more emotional room for whipped cream. Economists might quibble, but whipped cream seldom invites debate. By early spring, the Bureau of Small Necessities, a real department with a doorway too narrow for its title, convened to consider whether the iron armrests should curve inwards by another half-degree, thereby discouraging naps deemed uncivic before dusk. Minutes from the meeting reveal a lively exchange in which a delegate measured his own elbow 3 times, each yielding a different philosophy. Ultimately, the armrests stayed as they were, allowing brief naps to continue their subtle reign. Over lunchtime, the Bureau consoled itself by issuing a pamphlet reminding citizens that even short doses contribute to national poise, provided the hat remains on. Meanwhile, poets discovered the new benches resonated faintly when declaimed upon a mild tremor, running through the iron the way tea ripples when someone mentions weekend plans. Public readings cropped up at twilight. Verses about fog, bread prices, and unmailed letters drifted into the lamplight as sparrows negotiated closing hours. 1. Evening a stanza concerning unrequited postage stamps caused an entire row of benches to vibrate with what a listener claimed was empathetic rust. The prefecture sent a clerk to investigate and returned with the conclusion that poetry, unlike varnish, cannot be measured with a thermometer, and therefore poses no regulatory threat. Summer, ever keen on repetition, returned. A census counted 4,732 regulation benches within the city limits, leaving precisely 8 vintage benches untouched for heritage sentiment. Tour guides struggled to invent thrilling tales about standardized carpentry, so they emphasized the longevity of the screws, which were said to outlast even Parisian grudges. One guide, exhausted by his own itinerary, fell asleep on a 7th slat mid-monologue. The tourists tiptoed away, convinced they had witnessed an authentic moment of local repose. The bench later received a thank you note signed by everyone except the guide, who apparently dreamt the entire episode in real time. Of course, change arrived on cat-quiet feet. By 1907, aluminium appeared, light as resolute gossip, promising. Benches that resisted rust and weighed less than a baker's sigh. The city flirted with prototypes, discovering that aluminium echoed differently under monologues and proved slippery when courting drizzle. Some slats bent their reflections like elongated spoons, unsettling pigeons who prefer predictable self-portraits. After a year, the prefecture decided wood should remain sovereign, though aluminium was welcome to contemplate the experience and perhaps write memoirs. The prototypes were relocated to a lilac grove where they reportedly host philosophical bees on sunny afternoons. Decades blurred. World's fairs came and went. Parisians traded bowler hats for barrettes, then for whatever shape suggests uninvolved. Sophistication. Yet the benches persisted, repainted whenever a budget line met a brush, repaired each time a slat sighed under too much accordion. During the blackout nights of war, they served as unlit meeting point 7 slats, forming a password only those who could count calmly might recall. Peace returned, and benches resumed their primary duty of holding baguettes aloft, while owners gestured at clouds. A visiting mathematician calculated that any 2 citizens sitting at opposite ends of a regulation bench would, after 20 minutes, share precisely 1 coincidental thought. He recorded neither the thought nor the names, respecting the quiet. Privacy of civic furniture. Even now, if you wander the quays at dawn, mist curling like unspoken sentences, you will find the regulation benches waiting with familiar patience. Varnish has faded to something approaching historical parchment, but the slats remain steady, 5 1/8 centimeters apart. 7 in their company, ready to host the next pause in somebody's day. You can test the spacing with your fingertips if you like. The wood will neither hurry nor fuss. It remembers the carpenter's brass ruler, the inspector's mallet, the poet's tremor, and the chocolatier's whipped cream economics. If your eyes begin to drift closed, imagine. One bench in particular, perhaps. The one near the sycamore across from the quiet kiosk that sells postcards nobody quite needs. Picture the faint imprint of yesterday's newspaper still ghosting the paint, the smallest crumb anticipating gravity, and the seventh slat offering just a little more give than the rest. Hear, if you can, the distant echo of a mallet confirming. Everything is still aligned. Feel how the wood cools, then warms under the early sun, and notice how evenly the gaps breathe. Stay as long as you like. The prefecture accounted for that too. The bench will keep its simple arithmetic, holding the moment steady until even numbers, leaves, and distant footsteps blur into a single slow exhale, carrying you gently, reliably into sleep. You might not expect the diameter of a single grain of sand to matter very much to ships braving the fog-bound edges of the North Sea, and yet, on a salt-spattered morning in 1837, the British Trinity House convened a committee to determine precisely how large those grains should be when poured into the hourglasses that kept lighthouse keepers awake and lanterns obedient. If you're still awake by the time we sift our way to the remarkably polite debate over whether angular grains encourage punctuality, feel free to subscribe though, truly, let the notion slip through your thoughts as lazily as sand between. Unheard fingers dot at first the keepers had filled their glasses with whatever beach lay nearest, coarse shingle from Cromer, whisper fine dust from the Isles of Scilly, or, in one optimistic experiment, pulverized eggshell offered by a gull who seemed to understand overtime pay. The result was a maritime lullaby of uneven minutes, some stretched like lazy taffy, others tumbling past with the brevity of a startled hiccup. Lantern wicks smoldered out of sequence, foghorns cleared their throats too early, and mariners, unaware of the granular democracy at play, wondered why time strolled on one coast and galloped on another. Trinity House, preferring its seas tragic only in poetry, dispatched inspectors armed with little brass sieves no wider than a child's grin. They called these sieves calibrators, perhaps to veil the delightful absurdity of inspecting. Individual flex for insubordination, the first official sample, taken from a windswept dune near Blyth, measured exactly 700 grains to the dram, a unit chosen because someone misread drama in an old handbook and found a mistake. Too entertaining to correct. Inspectors poured this sand into test glasses, set beside the ticking of a parliamentary carriage clock, and watched. Each grain slipped with a civility that suggested rehearsal. Encouraged, they drafted a memorandum titled Specifications for literal silica in chronometric service, whose footnotes contained more size than facts. Word reached the keepers by packet boat. One veteran at Flamborough Head opened the envelope, sprinkled a pinch of the sample on his tongue like suspicious seasoning, declared it tasted of respectable punctuality, and tipped the remainder into his reserved decanter labeled Emergencies of Moonlight. To ensure uniformity, the committee mandated that all future lighthouse sand be dredged from a single stretch of beach on Holy Island, sifted through silken gauze, sun-dry exactly 43 minutes, then sealed in waxed muslin bags stamped with a cormorant in mid-lecture. The muslin, almost translucent, allowed keepers to judge consistency merely by squinting and evaluation, method praised for requiring no formal training beyond ownership of eyelets. Bags traveled north and south by coastal packet, their passage, recorded in ledgers so wide that clerks risked elbow cramp turning each page. Somewhere along the route, a sailor discovered the bags made excellent pillows during calm seas. He later complained that dreams measured in lighthouse minutes felt peculiarly elongated, as though sleep itself approved the regulation. Back on shore, keepers began the ritual of swapping old sand for new every quarter. They spread carpets of canvas on lantern room floors, appended their glasses, and coaxed the outgoing grains into waiting tins. These elder specks, still weary with duty, were often poured respectfully over nearby dunes, where they glimmered in slanted sunlight like medals awarded to geography. Visitors who happened upon such glittering heaps assumed smugglers had mislaid contraband sugar. Local children, more imaginative, staged minute-long battles using teaspoon catapults, thereby inventing the only war ever waged entirely to schedule. Even calibrated sand retained tiny opinions. A lighthouse on the Lizard Peninsula reported that in humid weather, the grains clung together, causing minutes to bunch like commuters at a narrow ticket gate. The keeper, a patient chap with eyebrows reminiscent of ship's rigging solved. The problem by warming the bag beside the lamp before filling the glass, citing tea etiquette for sand. Meanwhile, on Blakefair Isle, the grains ran too swiftly in winter gales, persuaded perhaps by the wind's haste. There, the keeper added a single oat husk, claiming it introduced just enough hesitation to restore maritime civility. Trinity. House filed the oat under local adjustment, a category expansive enough to fit any solution too cozy to outlaw. Collectors soon emerged, fascinated by the notion that every bag held a beach distilled into seconds. Portsmouth antiquarians displayed tiny vials labeled 7 minutes, late April, and 3 minutes fog variant, selling them for pennies to tourists who enjoyed bottling time the way others bottled seawater or faint regret. One enterprising stationer in Whitby offered souvenir hourglasses no larger than a walnut, calibrated at exactly one polite nod, roughly 15. Courteous seconds ideal for brewing moral resolve before writing a difficult letter. The post office, noticing a spike in unmailed drafts, suspected that glasses encouraged reflection to the point of procrastination. They shrugged. Postage, unlike time, could wait. Years drifted like obedient grains. Oil lamps gave way to Fresnel, lenses whose prismatic shimmer rendered light itself suspiciously efficient. Yet the hourglasses stayed, brass-framed, waist-narrow, sand whispering downward with the conscience of rainfall. Keepers often leaned close to listen, convinced they could hear a hushing note, as if the glass reminded them that loneliness, though, vast, keeps excellent company with routine. Logbooks from Eddiston mention that during particularly fierce storms, the falling sand sounded like distant applause, perhaps from shipwrecks avoided. Logbooks from calmer nights note nothing at all. Proving calm is its own entry dot. In 1896, an eager engineer proposed replacing hourglasses with mechanical timers wound by key and regulated by springs. He demonstrated a prototype, which hummed like a thoughtful wasp and clicked every 60 seconds to announce its ongoing certainty. Keepers gathered round, hands in pockets, and listened. Some nodded at the ingenuity. Others frowned, hearing in each click the possibility of argument. One keeper remarked that you can't drown out a click with a cup of tea, whereas sand accepts. Company quietly. The engineer, who cherished punctuality more than peace, nevertheless conceded, and the device found employment counting loaves at a bakery where yeast, unlike sand, enjoyed conversation till the 20th century ushered in electrified. Lamps and automated lenses spun by clockwork pulleys. Hourglasses moved from lantern decks to cozy back rooms. Calibrated sand still measuring watch shifts, coffee steepings, or the exact length of an overdue sigh. Wartime blackouts briefly silenced the lights, but the glasses kept trickling in. The darkness, marking minutes that were officially invisible yet privately undeniable. After peace returned, lighthouse visitors noted the hourglasses more than the lights, perhaps because the former shared a pace with the human pulse while the latter blazed beyond it. Eventually, radio beacons and quartz chronometers rendered granular. Minutes quaint, sandbags dwindled. The Holy Island beach settled back into uncounted anonymity. A final directive typed on paper thin enough to flutter with historical resignation allowed keepers to source local sand once more, provided accuracy be maintained in spirit, if not in silica. Modern keepers, fewer now and supplemented by censors, sometimes fill ceremonial glasses for visiting school children. They pour the grains with care, flip the vessel, and invite guesses. Is this minute longer than the last, or merely kinder? Children, who understand ritual instinctively, often whisper rather than answer, as though disturbing the flow might cancel recess. Should you find yourself walking a quiet shore at dusk, you might notice a flicker far out where sea meets sky. Imagine behind that pulse, a small brass hourglass gently exhaling its grains, each one shaped by decree yet rolling with secret individuality. The keeper, coat buttoned against damp wind, watches the last crystal vanish through the narrow waist before returning the glass without ceremony. Somewhere a gull calls, somewhere a buoy answers, and the moment loosens like shoelaces after a long march. The sand resumes its gentle descent, as inevitable and unhurried as sleep itself, carrying with it the lull of regulated time, a hush so steady you may begin, quite easily, to let your own thoughts drift downward, grain by patient grain, into the soft, measured darkness. You might not expect the bowl of an ordinary teaspoon to have shifted the cadence of afternoon tea across an entire empire, and yet, on a softly overcast Monday in 1897, a subcommittee of His Majesty's Board of Trade gathered in a room that smelled faintly of overboiled water to decide exactly how many minims of liquid should fit inside that modest silver hollow. If you're still awake by the time we swirl our way to the moment an inspector tried and politely failed to measure the viscosity with a pocket barometer, feel free to subscribe. Though honestly, don't lift a finger on my account. The spoon will keep doing its quiet arithmetic whether anybody clicks anything at all. Their earliest teaspoons lived cheerful, unregulated lives. Some were rounded like sleepy moons, others tapered to delicate leaf points, still others slouched wide and shallow as if dreaming of ladlehood. Country inns kept mismatched handfuls rattling in chipped cruet pots, while grand hotels displayed regimented rows polished bright enough to rehearse the day's compliments in. One London hostess boasted her spoons could hold precisely 9 sugar grains each, though guests noticed the count varied depending on whether the grains behaved. Pharmacists, always fond of certainty, complained that a teaspoon of cough tincture might soothe or submerge, depending entirely on who had last arranged the silver drawer. Thus did concern steep, stirring itself into official paperwork. The subcommittee, armed with rulers slim as winks and balances sensitive enough to blush at a breath, began by sampling spoons from every province. They invited donations. Boxes arrived from Calcutta, Cape Town, and Carlisle, jingling like distant tambourines. Clerks decanted them onto green blotting paper and labeled each specimen with a coded tag: B for Britannia Silver, T for Tarnish, P for Personality, because some spoons, it turned out, possessed quirks too endearing to ignore. One particularly winsome piece from York sported a faint twist halfway up the shank, giving it the air of a shy dancer caught mid-curtsy. The committee set it gently aside, not wishing to dampen its spirit with calipers. Measurements followed. Minim's tiny droplets, equal to 1/60th of a fluid dram, were counted out with glass pipettes that trembled like thin icicles. A spoon qualifying for a full medicinal charge needed to cradle exactly 60 minims, neither more, which risked overdosing the congested, nor less, which might leave coughs feeling merely under-remarked. Trials took place in hush batches of 15. Each droplet made the faintest kiss against silver. Clerks recorded the numbers in columns so neat they resembled fence posts across a snowy field. When a spoon overflowed at 61 minims, Someone muttered it was generous but misguided, the sort of verdict usually reserved for eccentric uncles. Public reaction trickled in through letters to the Times. One correspondent argued that a larger spoon encouraged hydration, an undeniable civic virtue. Another feared that shrinking the bowl would make sugar cubes appear immodest. A third, signing only as sleepless in Surbiton, worried the new standard might jingle his midnight. Cocoa routine. The committee read each missive aloud at tea time, letting dissent dissolve like the very lumps under debate. Their conclusion: 60 minims felt tidy. Not severe, not lax, just dignified enough to keep chemist content and sippers oblivious. Factories. Received the ruling by telegram. Bowl capacity 60 minims, stop length 3 inches stop. Adequate gleam recommended, but not compulsory. Toolmakers adjusted dies with the slow certainty of chess pieces. Being nudged into checkmate, every press of metal now produced near identical cavities. Shallow enough that reflections curled softly at the edges, deep enough to hide a modest whisper. Inspectors visited workshops, dropping red wax pellets into sample spoons. If the wax fell flush with the rim exactly once the pellet cooled, approval followed. Too high a mound suggested secret vanity. Too low, timid austerity. Both sins earned a discreet filing on the underside until compliance could be coaxed. Holmes across. Britain noticed the change not at the tea table, but at the medicine chest. Bottles of liver salts came with instructions newly printed in a forthright serif. 1 teaspoon 60 minims. Mothers measured doses with confidence previously reserved for choir pitch. Children, unimpressed, maintained that any spoon standard or rope tasted equally of dread. Druggists, at last unburdened by conversion charts, found time to re-alphabetize. The liniment shelf, a tranquility that soon spread through the apothecary trade like a polite yawn. Meanwhile, ocean steamers exported the regulation worldwide. Stewards on the RMS Ophidian distributed cabin spoons stamped with a tiny crown enclosing the numeral 60, reassuring passengers that their quinine nightcaps would obey London arithmetic, even as the ship's clocks danced past meridians. One traveler, convinced his seasickness was alleviated by smaller doses, attempted to file down the rim of his spoon during a bout of rough weather. The result resembled a dented thimble, and he resigned himself to the official volume with stoic diplomacy. Not. Every region welcomed uniformity. In Sydney, colonial hostesses complained that 60 minims looked meager beside sprawling Anzac biscuits. They lobbied for an austral allowance, perhaps 75 minims to match local exuberance. The Board of Trade responded with a pamphlet explaining that multiplying sugar solved both problems. Biscuits remained proportional, and spoons stayed civilized. Whether this settled the matter or merely sweetened it out of mind, archives do not say. Collectors emerged, as they always do when decimals collide with nostalgia. They sought pre-standard deep bowls, relics of an age when a teaspoon might contain a puddle ambitious enough to baptize a gnat. Auctions describe such pieces in whispers. Early Victorian holds 83 minims, ideal for flamboyant porridge. Prices drifted upward, though never quickly enough to disturb anyone's pulse. Museums mounted displays titled The Measure of Moderation, where visitors gazed at graduated rows of spoons, like students studying the slow evolution of common sense. Decades slipped by. Electric kettles replaced hob whistles, and tea bags parachuted into mugs without ceremony. Yet the 60 minim spoon endured, its shape copied in chrome, melamine, even biodegradable bamboo. Designers flirted with squared edges, ridged handles, playful polka dots, but the bowl remained a quiet ellipse, unfussed by fashion. During the austerity years, some manufacturers hollowed the handle to save metal. Critics feared such dieting might unbalance the pour, but tests showed the liquid still found its middle. As though gravity respected legislative precedent. In 1963, a university lab tried to determine whether the spoons truly delivered 60 minims of every conceivable fluid. Water obeyed. Olive oil, cheekier, measured 58 before meniscus tricks crept in. Honey refused outright, lingering bulbous above the rim like a cat considering an inconvenient puddle. The researchers published graphs shaped suspiciously like dessert toppings, concluding that the teaspoon was accurate under reasonable viscosities, a definition left politely vague for syrup to interpret at leisure. Today, if you remove a teaspoon from any kitchen drawer in Britain or Canada, or India, or with mild deviations, even Sydney, you're likely holding that 1897 compromise. Press it into a mound of sugar and level it with the back of a knife, and you will possess a small silver certificate of historical patience. It will sparkle less than a smartphone screen, speak less than a kettle's whistle, yet still carry within its curve the collective decision that time, health, and sweetness deserve at least one fixed measure in a world otherwise prone to stirring. Should drowsiness find you now, imagine a sideboard stocked for late-night cocoa, mild lamplight, a porcelain cup, a tin of powder, and beside it the spoon quietly certain, waiting, content to lift precisely what it was born to bear. Picture the grain sliding off the spoon's edge, each one a shy minim counting itself into darkness, until powder and milk swirl into that faint steam we call comfort. Hear the spoon settle on the saucer with a microscopic sigh, its duty done. To diffraction, the cup warms your hands. The minutes lengthen to the pace of a gentle stir, and the standardized bowl, having served civilizations grand and domestic alike, rests in silence, inviting you to do precisely the same. You might not expect the graceful, almost bashful curve of a glass milk bottle, neck to have redirected the morning routines of an entire kingdom. Yet on a cloud-smudged Thursday in 1934, the British Milk Marketing Board assembled in a drafty hall that smelled faintly of warm hay and hesitant optimism to decree precisely how wide that slender ring of glass must be. If you're still awake by the time we saunter to the moment an inspector tried, with exquisite politeness, to measure viscosity using nothing but a fountain pen and hope, you could always subscribe, but please don't rise on my account. The bottles will continue their quiet arithmetic, whether or not a single thumb remembers the gesture. The first bottles, blown by village glassmiths who thought more about sunshine than standardization, varied like unruly cousins, some with stout throats fit to host a chrysanthemum, others pinched so primly that cream staged mutinies at the lip and refused to mingle with tea. Dairymen complained that foil caps either sagged into puddles or perched like cymbals ready to clatter. Postmen, forced to balance these bottles on early morning rounds, reported that wider mounts tolerated bicycle vibrations, while narrow ones behaved like nervous alto singers. Letters arrived smelling faintly of buttermilk, in effect not strictly forbiddance, but generally considered whimsical. Something the board decided must be done before breakfast, lest all sense of proportion. Samples poured in from every shire, rattling in straw-lined crates as though rehearsing for a glass percussion ensemble. Clerks arrayed them on trestle tables, each bottle tagged with a neat card indicating diameter, dairy, and, inexplicably, the cow's preferred meadow. When sunlight slanted through high windows, hundreds of mechs glittered like dewy throat lozenges. For giants, the committee, armed with calipers polished to courtroom shine, began measuring. They sought the Goldilocks aperture, wide enough to let cream glide without showboating, narrow enough to keep blue tits from redecorating porches with liberated foil. Early trials settled around 43 millimeters, though one bottle from Devon insisted on 42 and a philosophical argument about the meaning of abundance. For 3 gentle afternoons, the debate wafted between fractions. Chairs creaked, pens scratched, tea cooled to reflective temperature. At last a shy civil Servant suggested 40-2- and -2-3, an absurdly civil compromise nobody wished to recite before dawn. The chairman cleared his throat, declared 43 handsomely ordinary, and the room exhaled as though it too had found a collar that fit. Word of the ruling traveled by telegram. Neck width 43 mm stop cream line slip may not exceed. 1-2 mm below cap stop glass. To be flint or amber at discretion stop. Factories adjusted molds with the unhurried precision of organ tuners. Each molten gob of silica descended into its iron cradle, cooled, and emerged wearing the sanctioned silhouette, neither swaggering nor shy, simply content. Inspectors toured the kilns brandishing brass gauges shaped like modest halos. If a neck resisted the embrace, it earned a chalk mark and a brief lecture on civic harmony. Workers swore they could hear compliant bottles hum faintly as they rolled. Along conveyor belts, like cats purring over freshly ironed napkins. In the dairy yards, crate packers quickly discovered that 43mm necks nested more courteously, reducing the soft clink-clink symphonies that had haunted rural mornings for decades. Villagers noticed the hush and being British, mostly approved by saying nothing at all. With uniform necks came uniform foil caps, little moons of aluminium stamped by the newly formed Cream Limitation Bureau. The Bureau's rulebook specified that each cap must dimple exactly 1 millimeter, under an average thumb, thus assuring customers that the bottle's interior remained unsullied by curious insects or village gossip. To test this, auditors visited doorsteps at dawn, pressing caps like pianists trying a single tentative note. One cap, chilled by coastal fog, refused to dimple on schedule, and the auditor recorded a stern marginalia, suspects mild obstinacy, recommend warmer porch. Elsewhere, an enthusiastic milkman punched every cap with theatrical flourishes until reminded that indentation, like good manners, thrives on restraint. Housewives, delighted by the cap's predictable give, devised informal betting pools. Would today's dimple reveal cream of exactly 12 millimeters? Or had the cow enjoyed an unusually philosophical night's cud? Wagers were settled in scones, never in coin, because breakfast is a delicate economy. The regulation neck transformed more than porches. In London cafes, baristas noted that pouring time stabilized. The familiar glug-glug found a metronome, easing cues and tempers. Alike, railway dining cars adopted the bottles, confident that predictable gurgles would harmonize with the click of carriage joints. A journalist for the Illustrated London News wrote an earnest column praising the newfound civility of dairy glass, though readers mainly admired the engraving of a bottle wearing its foil cap like a jaunty beret. Glassblowers released from the tyranny of improvisation, explored artistry at the base, instead designing subtle swirls and embossed cows that danced just above the sediment line. One artist attempted a tiny frieze of Stonehenge around the pond, but stopped after 3 trilithons, deciding eternity could wait until tea time by late summer. Reports arrived of cream separation behaving with textbook obedience, always rising to a crisp line of finger width below the cap, as though summoned by an invisible butler. The Ministry of Health quietly rejoiced, for this facilitated dairy inspector's newest gadget, a mirrored stick exactly 12 millimeters wide that, when dipped, should kiss the cream line without becoming coy. Early field tests produced satisfying clanks and only 2 instances of reflected sky confusing the reading. Meanwhile, blue tits, confronted with sturdier caps and statistically uniform payoff, redirected their talents toward breadcrumb economy. Bird journals of the era record a brief spike in crust appreciation, suggesting avian culture benefits from regulation just as surely as human breakfast. Of course, not everyone surrendered to neatness. A small syndicate of artisanal dairies near the Welsh border insisted their cows produced philosophically larger fat globules. requiring a 44mm neck, proper self-expression. They maintained secret molds and smuggled bottles across hedge-lined lanes, where collectors prized the rebels for their daring extra millimeter. The board, preferring persuasion to prosecution, invited the dairymen to a blind tasting. Judges, armed with identical scones, failed to distinguish the outlaw cream from the loyalist, save that one jar of jam vanished mysteriously faster than regulations could track. The syndicate, noting the room's polite shrug, eventually adopted the 43mm mold, while continuing to boast about the virtues of their cow's introspection and arrangement everyone considered charmingly circular when glass. Shortages struck during the war years, the standard neck proved a quiet ally. Bottles could be reused across regions without fear of mismatched caps. Return and wash schemes flourished. Grandmothers, repurposing empties into vases for modest tulips, praised the neck for holding a single stem upright at a decorous angle proof. They said that utility and grace might share a breakfast table. Even austerity cookbooks referenced the measurement, used 2 regulation necks of milk, substituted for cumbersome fractions, because nearly every pantry sheltered at least one rinse relic awaiting the next delivery. Children learned arithmetic by counting neck widths rather than spoons, discovering that multiplication hides more pleasantly in dairy glass than in chalk dust. Decades flowed on. Plastic jugs made cautious overtures, but never fully charmed the early morning doorstep. Yet even they imitated the glass template, pinching at 43mm as though the measurement were genetically encoded. Historians of packaging call this the inertia of comfort. Meanwhile, collectors of antique bottles meet at quiet fairs, tipping each specimen to inspect embossing, but always acknowledging the neck first, like nodding to an old friend before admiring their new hat. The term pre-43 now signifies a certain whimsical unpredictability, much as pre-decimal hints at coins that jingle like eccentric uncles. Museums dedicate small cabinets to the transition, where visitors gaze at rows of necks widening or narrowing by lonely millimeters, sensing, perhaps without knowing why, the hush of breakfast long settled. If your eyelids feel pleasantly weighted. Now, picture one winter dawn on a silent terrace street. Milkman's boots crunch faint snow. Bottles clink into galvanized racks, and each neck precise, familiar catches the first hint of gray light. Inside, kettles murmur, teaspoons wait. 60 minims, of course, and a hand reaches past the dozing cat to peel back foil with a practiced thumb. The cream line sits obediently, exactly where the Board of Trade once imagined it should. Tea swirls. The day stretches its limbs, and the bottle, having executed its measured duty, settles into companionable condensation. Somewhere far off, another committee considers another fraction, but here, for the length of a slow sip, everything pours at a pace kind enough to follow into dreams. You might not expect the quiet circumference of a marmalade jar lid to steer the tempos of breakfast chatter. Yet on a pale, cinnamon-smelling Tuesday in 1958, the British glass container, council gathered behind double doors varnished the color of strong tea to decide that every twist-off cap sealing jam, jelly, or curious pickles should measure precisely 63 millimeters across, give or take a whisper. If you're still awake when we swirl to the minute, an inspector tried ever so gently to gauge. Vacuum freshness pop, using nothing but a stethoscope and mild encouragement. Feel free to subscribe. Though honestly, don't let your thumbs strain for buttons. The lids will keep their slow arithmetic, whether anyone clicks, claps, or merely sighs approvingly. Before the ruling, farmhouse kitchens resembled polite bazaars of haphazard girth. Some jars hid beneath lids no broader than a shilling. Others were saucers of tin so wide they could double as modest moonlets. Home canners scavenged old Bovril tops, mustard crowns, and wartime cocoa tins, persuading each to mate with whatever. Glass awaited. The result sounded like percussion: clink, rattle, reluctant squeak. Bees found the gaps intriguing. Wasps, bolder still, auditioned for residency. Grocers complained that stacked pyramids leaned like thoughtful philosophers, and lorry drivers swore jars shifted during turns, improvising lullabies of rolling glass on corrugated crates. Something, murmured the council, must be done before crumpets lost confidence in gravity dot samples arrived from Manchester, Maidstone, even the Isle of Man, each jar cushioned in straw that crackled under fluorescent lights like 1,000 miniature. Bonfires refusing to catch. Clerks measured diameters with brass calipers, so dainty they could pass for eyebrow scissors at a distance. Numbers queued obediently in ledgers, 61, 64, and a smidge. 60-2-.8 and evidently proud of it. A Sheffield delegate proposed rounding everything to a nice, even 2.5 inches, but a London chemist, armed with decimals and devotion, argued that millimeters felt friendlier to rubber gaskets. The room paused, as rooms do when converting units, and ultimately settled on 63 large enough to let strawberry seeds gossip at the rim, small enough to keep pickled onions from staging overcrowded protests. Telegrams rattled outward. Standard lead diam 63 mm stop thread, pitch 4 per cm, stop concave button diam 15 mm for vacuum integrity. STOP. Factories responded with the fortitude of orchestras tuning to a single oboe. Presses stamped sheet steel circles that cooled on wire racks, each sporting 4 gentle spirals calculated to seat upon the jar with a sigh rather than a grunt. A special punch pressed the central dimple, the famous pop button designed to sit, ever so slightly concave until the seal surrendered to breakfast. Inspectors toured production lines wielding nickel rings, tiny halos of authority slipping them over each lid. A compliant cap glided through like a swan beneath a garden bridge. Rebels snagged, squeaked, and earned chalk crosses plus a brief. Motivational speech about consistency. Households notice first not the size but the sound. That small. Satisfying plink when the button inverted beneath a spoon's nudge. Children learned to chase the noise as proof of freshness. Fathers wielding butter knives pretended it was a doorbell to a kingdom of peel and pectin. One mother declared the pop a kinder alarm clock than any rooster because it promised toast in the same breath. Cookery writers quickly updated recipes, seal, at once with a standard 63 ml lid. Listen for the applause. The applause nearly always came, except on occasion, for a rogue batch of quince jelly so stubborn it required a gentle tap with a thimble before admitting defeat. Notes were made. Quince, it turned out, respects regulation, but negotiates timing that not everyone applauded. An eccentric Oxfordshire Preserve Guild insisted their heritage gooseberry pots demanded 50-9-mm bonnets by ancestral right. They petitioned for exemption, citing poetry of jar-top curvature and the need for sympathetic acoustics when lids cooled. The council arranged a tasting. Judges, armed with identical oatcakes, admitted the gooseberry possessed verve, but found the smaller caps left threads prone to sticky recriminations. The guild relented, adopting 63s while publishing pamphlets praising the spacious sky therein. Diplomacy, like marmalade, benefits from a little zest. Uniformity rippled outward. Railway refreshments adopted the jars, confident the threads would grip despite carriage tremors. Corner shops embraced the neat hexagonal cartons designed to cradle exactly 12 jars, 6 by 2, no wobble, no worry. A Manchester designer produced a wooden shelf whose circular cutouts hugged the lids so snugly the jars seemed to levitate. Critics called it Levain for shelving. Housewives, liberated from rummaging for compatible tops, repurposed spare moments for leisurely dollops on shortbread, a redistribution of time civil servants later cited as evidence of domestic efficiency. During the sugar rush and aftermath, glassmakers experimented with lighter jars to spare both pennies and planet. Thinner walls risked shattering under the eager twist of morning wrists, so engineers nudged the lid's knurling just a whisker deeper, providing grip without grudge. Someone calculated that nationwide, the new knurl saved roughly as much effort as climbing Ben Nevis twice a year, though nobody could agree whose wrists performed the metaphorical ascent. Newspapers ran the story, beside weather forecasts, prompting one reader to inquire whether climbers should pack scones. The editor replied, quite sensibly, that altitude pairs well with jam, lid intact. Warriors' blackouts necessitated darker glass amber, almost tea-colored to guard vitamins against capricious searchlights. Yet even these jars were their 63mm. Crowns, shining faintly like disciplined embers in the pantry gloom. Soldiers on leave could unscrew home-sent parcels by touch alone. The thread pattern, memorized in trenches, returned them briefly to wooden tables and ticking mantelpieces. After peace, Ladies' Magazine suggested painting spent lids into coasters or pincushions shaped like polite hedgehogs. The standard diameter simplified crafting. Hedgehogs across the realm wore equally spaced bristles, a symmetry they appeared. To enjoy dot collectors, inevitably, pursued the brief liminal period late 57 to early 58 when jars, for experimental 62s or ambitious 64s. Swap meets erupted with displays of lids measured in whispers, a hair under, a dream over, the legendary 60-2-point-9 with mispressed pop. Prices remained gentle. No one wished to rob breakfast of its innocence. Museums. Devoted alcoves to the Great Convergence, arranging jars in gradual spectral order, emerald pickles, ruby cherries, topaz marmalade, each topped by the same unassuming circle, proof that boundaries sometimes soothe rather than hinder dot by the 1980s. Plastic caps flirted with the market, boasting ratchet rings and easy peel seals. Yet manufacturers retained the 63mm promise, perhaps out of affection, perhaps because retooling is expensive, but mostly, one suspects, because breakfast ears had grown addicted to the metal pop that plastic could only imitate. With a sulky crackle, dietitians praised the audible freshness as an embargo against forgetfulness. If the lid refused to sing, best fetch a newer jar. Somewhere in Cheltenham, a small electromechanical gadget appeared, a popometer, claiming to chart the decibels of each opening and predict spreadability. Sales were modest. Most people trusted their ears and, failing that, their noses. Should your eyelids feel agreeably heavy now, imagine a shelf in early morning half-light, neat rows of jars wearing identical silver circlets, each button concave. Waiting for the day's first curious thumb, the kettle murmurs. Bread rises slow within the toaster. Outside, milk bottles, with their regulation necks, clink acknowledgement. You break the jar seal pop so soft it almost thinks you. Citrus fragrance lifts, polite yet undeniable, filling the hush between ticking clock and purring cat. You spread brightness on toast, watch steam wander from the cup, and notice how the lid, now convex, rests beside the plate like a retiring symbol. Minutes lengthen, conversation drifts, and the uniform circle, its duty gracefully complete, glitters once, then settles, inviting you to do precisely the same, letting thought trickle quiet as syrup until the last echoes of breakfast mingle with the lullaby of sleep.